Ever wonder why the Federal Reserve doesn't aim for zero unemployment? It sounds counterintuitive. Shouldn't the goal be for everyone who wants a job to have one? But in reality, the Fed considers about 4% unemployment to be just right. In this video, we're going to break down why that number, 4%, has become the Goldilocks zone for the US economy. We'll explain how the Fed balances jobs and inflation, what 4% actually means, and why this number shows up again and again in policy decisions. The Federal Reserve has a pretty simple job on paper: promote maximum employment and keep prices stable. This dual mandate, set by Congress in the late 1970s through the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, was designed to give the Fed a clear purpose during a time of economic instability. It means the Fed constantly walks a tightrope, supporting job growth without letting inflation spiral out of control. One of the key indicators it watches: the unemployment rate. But here's the catch: maximum employment doesn't mean everyone is working. There will always be people between jobs, switching careers, or entering the workforce for the first time. So the Fed looks for something called full employment, a level where most people who want a job can get one without putting too much upward pressure on wages and prices. Because when unemployment gets too low, businesses have to compete for a smaller pool of workers, often by raising wages, which can lead to higher costs and eventually higher prices across the economy. So why 4%? Economists use a concept called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. It's the sweet spot where unemployment is low, but not so low that it pushes inflation higher. Below this level, companies start bidding up wages to attract workers, and that wage pressure can ripple through the economy as rising prices. Above it, there's too much slack in the labor market, too many people out of work, and that tends to push wages and prices down. But here's the thing: NAIRU isn't a fixed number. It's a moving target estimated by economists using models that evolve over time. It's not a hard data point. It's a best guess based on how inflation and employment interact. In the late 20th century, those estimates were higher, closer to 5 or 6%. But over the past few decades, structural changes like globalization, technology, and demographic shifts have pulled that number down. Today, most estimates put NAIRU right around 4%. And that's why the Fed keeps coming back to it. It strikes a balance between job availability and price stability. The idea of targeting around 4% unemployment hasn't always been the norm. Different Fed chairs have interpreted full employment through the lens of their times and the challenges they faced. In the early 1980s, Paul Volcker was focused on fighting runaway inflation. Interest rates hit 20%, and unemployment soared past 10% before getting stabilized. Alan Greenspan, who followed, saw tight labor markets as a warning sign for inflation, but oversaw an era of both low inflation and relatively low unemployment. Then came Ben Bernanke, who tied interest rate guidance directly to unemployment threshold, explicitly signaling how the Fed would respond as the job market changed. Janet Yellen embraced the idea that you could have sub 4% unemployment without triggering inflation, as long as expectations remained anchored. And under Jerome Powell, the Fed has adopted a flexible average inflation targeting approach, signaling comfort with temporary dips below or above 4% as long as long-term trends stay stable. So while the number has shifted over time, one thing is clear: 4% has emerged as a kind of benchmark, low enough to signal strength, but not so low it spooks the Fed. To really understand why 4% matters, it helps to look at the data behind the theory. First, there's the Phillips Curve, a classic economic relationship that shows how inflation and unemployment move in opposite directions. In the 1960s and 70s, the curve had a steep downward slope. As unemployment dropped, inflation climbed quickly. But since the 1990s, that relationship has flattened. Today, even with low unemployment, inflation doesn't spike the way it used to. That's one reason the Fed is more comfortable letting unemployment hover around 4% or even lower without panicking. Next, consider the labor force participation rate. Back in 2000, it peaked above 67%. Now, it's closer to 62%, mostly due to aging demographics and slower population growth. So even if the unemployment rate is low, the pool of available workers is smaller, making 4% feel tighter than it might have decades ago. And finally, NAIRU estimates themselves have come down. In the 1990s, economists pegged it around 6%. Today, real-time estimates put it closer to 4%, or even a bit below. All these shifts labor trends, inflation dynamics, and model revisions help explain why 4% has become the new normal. Of course, not everyone agrees that 4% is the right target. Critics argue that even at 4%, millions of people are still unemployed, and many of them come from historically marginalized communities. In fact, with a US labor force of around 167 million people, 4% unemployment means roughly 6.7 million individuals are out of work. Averages can hide a lot. Underemployment, wage stagnation, and discouraged workers who stopped looking altogether don't always show up in the headline number. Some economists believe we should aim lower, not just to create jobs, but to push for broader participation and equity in the labor market. On the flip side, more traditional voices warn that pushing unemployment too low can reignite inflation. The sacrifice ratio tells us that once inflation takes off, it can take a sharp rise in unemployment just to bring it back down. So the Fed's challenge is real. Push too hard on jobs and you risk inflation. Tighten too soon and you leave workers behind. So why does the Fed keep aiming for 4% unemployment? It's not about perfection. It's about balance. At around 4%, the labor market is tight enough to keep most people working, but not so tight that inflation starts to spiral. It's the level where the Fed believes the economy can run smoothly, sustainably, and with minimal intervention. And while that number isn't set in stone, it remains a critical signal in how the Fed sets interest rates, manages inflation, and supports long-term stability. Thanks for watching. If you're curious about how macroeconomics shapes everything from your paycheck to your portfolio, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment if you got thoughts on the Fed's 4% target or questions you want me to cover next. I'll see you in the next one.